The man was lying. Eisenhower knew it. The man knew that Eisenhower knew it. And Eisenhower had already decided what he was going to do about it, not because he was angry and not because the lie was surprising, but because he had been preparing for this exact moment since the morning of April 12, 1945, when he had walked into Ohrdruf and understood, with the specific clarity that only direct witness produces, that the denial was coming and that the only answer to it was evidence that could not be argued away. He had the evidence, he was about to use it. The official sitting across from him was a local German administrator, a man with a title and an office and the specific composure of someone who had spent years operating inside a system that required certain things to be spoken about in certain ways. He had managed the logistics of a region, he had signed documents, he had processed requisitions, he had been, in every functional sense, part of the machinery, and he was telling Eisenhower he had not known about the camp, about what it contained, about what had been happening for years in the facility located close enough to his administrative offices that the smoke had been visible on certain days, that the trains had passed through stations his staff used, that the absence of entire categories of people from the streets of the surrounding towns had been a fact of daily life rather than a matter of rumor. He had not known. Eisenhower let him finish. He did not interrupt. He did not challenge the individual claims as they were made. He gave the official the full length of the lie, every smoothly delivered sentence of it, and then he stood up. He told the official to get in the car. By the end of this video, you will understand the single decision Eisenhower made in the spring of 1945 that historians argue is one of the primary reasons Holocaust denial never fully consolidated in the West in the decades immediately after the war, and why the system he built to prevent it is facing pressure today in ways he explicitly predicted and warned about. You will also understand why the lie Eisenhower heard that day was not the last time that specific lie would be told, and what it means that the man who heard it chose to answer it the way he did, rather than the way almost any other commander in his position would have answered it. This channel covers the decisions that shaped the world that the textbooks compressed into a paragraph. If you are new here, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. New video every 2 days. Now, back to the car, back to the official, and back to where Eisenhower was taking him. The drive was short. That was part of what made the lie so extraordinary in its construction. The camps in the German occupation zone were not hidden in remote locations accessible only to those with specific knowledge and deliberate intent to find them. They were embedded in the geography of ordinary German life. They used local labor, they were supplied by local businesses, they were administered by bureaucracies that intersected, at dozens of points, with the ordinary administrative machinery of the regions they occupied. The smoke from the crematoria rose over towns where people went to work and came home and had dinner and put their children to bed. The official's office was not far from the camp. The drive took minutes. Eisenhower did not speak during it. The official, in the accounts that survived this encounter, attempted to fill the silence. He offered context, he drew distinctions, he began constructing in real time the more sophisticated version of the lie that would replace the simple version when the simple version became untenable. The version that acknowledged certain facts while preserving the essential claim, that responsibility had belonged to someone else, somewhere else, at a level above his specific position and his specific knowledge and his specific signature on the documents that had passed through his office. Eisenhower did not respond to any of it. He was waiting for the car to stop. But here is the thing about that drive that the official could not have understood at the time, and that most people who know this story still do not fully understand today. Eisenhower was not taking the official to the camp to punish him. He was not taking him there as a form of justice, or as an expression of the moral outrage that the situation might seem to have warranted. He was taking him there for a reason that was colder and more deliberate and more consequential than either of those things. He was taking him there to make him a witness. And in April 1945, making witnesses was the most important work Eisenhower believed he could do. Because the denial was already here, not waiting for the post-war period to emerge. Already here. Already being deployed in the conversations between German civilians and Allied soldiers in every town and village that the advance had reached. The lie Eisenhower had just heard in the official's office had been heard by American officers across the occupation zone. It had been heard so many times, with such consistency of structure and such similarity of language, that it could not have been accidental. It had been prepared, agreed upon, distributed through some network of understanding that did not require explicit coordination because the people deploying it understood, without being told, what the version of events that served their interests required them to say. I did not know. The car stopped. But before the doors opened, before Eisenhower walked the official through the gate and made him look at what was there is a question underneath this story that is more important than the one we have been answering. We have been asking what Eisenhower did. The deeper question is why it worked, and the answer to that question reaches forward into the present day in a way that should make you uncomfortable. Because the mechanism Eisenhower was fighting in that car, the mechanism of the lie and the specific vulnerability in the record that the lie was designed to exploit is not a historical phenomenon. It is operational right now, and by the end of this video you will understand exactly how. The doors opened. Eisenhower walked into the camp. He did not look back to see whether the official was following. He knew the official was following because the official understood, at whatever level of conscious understanding remained available to him in that moment, that the time for choices about what to do next had passed. What the official encountered when he walked through the gate was not manageable by the mechanisms of composure. This is the detail that the accounts of these forced visits return to, with the consistency that marks something accurately observed. The camp in April and May of 1945 was not a place that could be successfully not looked at. It engaged every sense. It was present in ways that the most determined protective distance could not filter. It demanded encounter in its specific, physical, irreducible form, not the idea of the camp itself. The official looked. He did not look the way Eisenhower had looked at Ohrdruf 8 days before. Eisenhower had walked the full circuit deliberately, without allowing his staff to shorten the visit or to redirect him from anything. He had looked at everything with the specific intention of a man creating the kind of memory that can be called upon later, in a courtroom, or a conversation, or a piece of testimony, as the witness account of a man who was present. He had let it reach him because he understood that the purpose of the witness was not to manage the experience but to have it. The official's looking was different. It was the looking of a man encountering a reality he had been avoiding and could no longer avoid. The accounts describe the progressive failure of the mechanisms that had been sustaining the distance, the smooth sentences that had been available in the office becoming unavailable here, the composure that had organized the lie losing its structural integrity in the presence of the thing the lie had been constructed to deny. He did not speak on the walk back to the car. He did not speak during the drive back. When he finally said something in the office where the encounter had begun, it was not the version of "I did not know" that had opened the conversation. It was something smaller, something that did not constitute a legal confession and could not be used as one. Something that acknowledged, in the specific, minimal, carefully bounded way of a man who understood that he was on the record, that the thing he had claimed not to know about was real, and that his claim had been what it had been. Eisenhower did not respond to it. He did not need to. He had not brought the official to the camp to extract a confession. He had brought him there for something more durable than a confession. But the letter Eisenhower wrote that night, the one he sent to Marshall the day after the Ohrdruf visit, the one that Marshall read and filed and that sat in an archive for decades, contained a single paragraph that nobody acted on fully, not until it was too late. That paragraph was not about the camps. It was about what would happen to the memory of them. And what Eisenhower wrote in it is the reason this story is not finished. And this is the part of the story that most accounts stop before reaching. This is the part that explains why what Eisenhower did with that one official and with the hundreds of other German civilians and administrators who were taken to the camps by American units in the spring of 1945 on his direct orders was not primarily about those specific people. It was about a problem that Eisenhower had identified on April 12th and that he had been working against every day since. The problem was time. Eisenhower understood, with the clarity that had made him effective as a planner throughout the war, that the conditions of April and May 1945 were temporary. The camps were newly found. The evidence was intact. The physical reality of what had been done was available to be encountered directly, not mediated through documentation or testimony or the language of historical analysis, but present in its specific, sensory, undeniable form. The survivors were alive and visible and reachable. The perpetrators were identifiable. The machinery was still legible in its components and its products. This window was closing. Time would do what time always does. The evidence would be catalogued and archived and moved into facilities where accessing it required effort and intention. The survivors would scatter. The physical sites would be cleared and repurposed or preserved in the specific, managed way that preservation changes the thing being preserved. The human memory of what had been witnessed would begin, as human memory always does, to simplify and to soften, not necessarily because the witnesses chose to let it, but because that is what memory does to things that are too large and too terrible to be held at full intensity indefinitely. And the lie would evolve. It would find more sophisticated forms. It would learn to engage with the evidence while preserving the essential distance between the acknowledgement and the full weight of what the acknowledgement required. It would become, in the decades after, a set of positions rather than a simple claim. Positions that could be adjusted and defended and maintained against the evidence in ways that the original I did not know could not have survived. Eisenhower could see this coming in April 1945, the way he had been able to see the operational requirements of a campaign from the planning stage. Not with certainty about the specific form it would take, with certainty about the direction and the mechanism and the specific vulnerability that needed to be addressed before the window closed. The vulnerability was the absence of witnesses, not documentary witnesses. The documentation was being assembled by the legal teams building the Nuremberg cases, by the military photographers and journalists who were recording everything they could reach, by Eisenhower's own insistence on inviting members of Congress and members of the British Parliament to see the camps while the evidence was present. The documentation would be extensive. It would be more extensive than almost any comparable historical event up to that point. But documentation can be challenged. Documents can be questioned about their provenance, their authenticity, their interpretation. Photographs can be contested. Chains of custody can be attacked. The specific language of legal proceedings creates opportunities for the skilled advocate to insert doubt between the evidence and the conclusion the evidence points toward. Witnesses are different. A person who was in a place and saw what was there and carries that seeing in their body as well as their memory is a different kind of evidence from a photograph or a document. The cross-examination that can destabilize a document is harder to deploy against a human being who can be asked, in front of an audience, to describe what they encountered with their own senses. The denial that can be constructed around a photograph requires the person constructing it to argue against something that the photograph cannot argue back. The denial constructed against a witness who was present requires arguing against the witness, and arguing against a witness is a different proposition. Eisenhower was making witnesses, as many as he could, as systematically as he could. German civilians from the surrounding towns escorted by American soldiers to the nearest camp, local officials like the man who had sat across from him and deployed the lie, members of the international press, politicians from both sides of the Atlantic. American soldiers ordered to walk through the facilities so that when they went home and someone told them it had not happened or had been exaggerated, they would have the specific, physical, sensory memory of a person who had been there to contradict the claim. He was not doing this out of emotion. He was doing it out of the same strategic intelligence that had organized the logistics of the largest amphibious invasion in history. He had identified a problem. He had analyzed the mechanism by which the problem would manifest. And he was addressing the mechanism at its point of vulnerability before the window closed. The official was part of that strategy, not a uniquely important part, a representative part. One more person placed in front of the reality before the reality became available only through the mediated forms that were easier to argue against. One more witness made, and then Eisenhower did something that nobody expected. Something that went beyond the camps, beyond the occupation, beyond the immediate task of documenting what had been found. He sent a specific request to a specific address in Washington that would not be acted upon for 11 years. The response, when it finally came, was not what he asked for. And the gap between what he asked for and what he got is where the vulnerability lives, the one that is being exploited right now. In the weeks that followed, Eisenhower continued the policy. The documentation of these forced visits, American units recording the names of the German civilians escorted through the camps, the dates, the locations, was itself part of the evidentiary record, not just the camps, the visiting of the camps, the fact of the German presence in them. The specific, datable, locatable creation of witnesses who could be called upon later when the denial arrived in its more organized forms. The denial did arrive, not in the spring of 1945, when the evidence was too immediate and too present for the organized form to establish itself. In the years and decades after, as the conditions Eisenhower had predicted came into being, the distance accumulated, the evidence receded into archives, the survivors aged and scattered, the specific, sensory reality of what had been encountered in those April weeks became available primarily through the mediated forms of testimony and documentation, rather than through the direct witness that Eisenhower had worked to maximize while it was possible. The denial found its forms, it found advocates. It developed the sophisticated positions that the simple "I did not know" could never have sustained, positions that could engage with the evidence while preserving the essential claim that the evidence, properly interpreted, did not mean what it appeared to mean. What it found, waiting for it, was the record Eisenhower had built. The witnesses he had made in April and May of 1945 were documented. They were traceable. The German civilians who had been escorted through the camps were on the record as having been there. The American soldiers who had been ordered to walk through the facilities were on the record. The members of Congress and Parliament who had accepted Eisenhower's invitations were on the record. The journalists and photographers were on the record. The record was not perfect. No record of events of this scale and complexity could be perfect, but it was extensive, and it was specifically constructed to address the mechanism of denial that Eisenhower had anticipated. It had been built by a man who understood evidence and who had used the window of April and May 1945 to maximize the specific kind of evidence that was hardest to argue against. The institutions that were built in the post-war period to maintain and extend that record, the memorial sites, the documentation centers, the educational programs, the legal frameworks that criminalized denial in some jurisdictions, were extensions of the project Eisenhower had begun on April 12 and pursued through the spring with the systematic intelligence of a man solving a strategic problem. Those institutions are facing pressure now, and here is the part that Eisenhower himself could not have fully anticipated. Though he came closer than anyone around him, the pressure is not coming from outside the system, it is coming from inside it. From people who were educated in institutions he helped build, using language he would have recognized, exploiting the specific structural weakness he identified in April 1945 and spent the rest of his life trying to address. He saw it coming, he said so. The question is whether anyone was listening. Those institutions are facing pressure now, not identical to the pressure of 1945, and not from identical sources, but the mechanism is recognizable. The same distance between the claim and the evidence that those who want to revise the record have always needed to create. The same language of alternative interpretation applied to documentation that seems unambiguous. The same argument that the record, properly understood, does not mean what it appears to mean. Eisenhower warned about this. Not in vague terms, in the specific terms of a man who understood how denial works and what it requires and where its vulnerabilities are. He warned about it in the letters he wrote in April 1945. He warned about it in the decisions he made about who to invite to the camps and how to document their presence there. He warned about it in the farewell address that is remembered for the military-industrial complex warning, but that contained, buried in its broader argument about the relationship between democratic institutions and the forces that pressure them, the same insight he had been acting on since Ohrdruf, that the distance between the truth and its denial is never fixed, that it requires active maintenance, that the people who want to create the distance are always working, and the people who want to prevent it cannot afford to stop working either. The official who had told Eisenhower he did not know had gone back to his life. He had carried what he had seen at the camp with him in whatever form the carrying took. The lie he had told had not survived the afternoon. The more sophisticated versions of the lie had not died with it. They had merely been postponed, sent looking for more favorable conditions than the immediate presence of the evidence in its undeniable form. Eisenhower had known this. He had not expected the afternoon to end the lie permanently. He had expected it to produce one witness who could not afterward claim that the reality of what the camp contained was unknown or unknowable or a matter of interpretation. One witness at a time. That was the strategy. That was what Eisenhower did when a Nazi official tried to lie to him about the camps. He did not argue. He did not produce the documentation. He took the man to the camp, and he made him look. Because Eisenhower understood something that the official had not anticipated, and that the people who would carry forward more sophisticated versions of the denial in the decades after had not fully accounted for. The most durable response to a lie is not a counter-argument. It is the truth itself, placed in front of the person telling the lie, in the form that is hardest to argue away, while the window to do so is still open. He used the window, he closed it one witness at a time. If this video gave you something the textbooks didn't, subscribe, hit the bell, and share it with one person who you think needs to hear this story. The next video covers the man Eisenhower called the most dangerous person he had ever dealt with in government. Not a foreign enemy, and not a military rival, an American, someone inside the system he had built to protect. His name was Joseph McCarthy. And what Eisenhower decided to do about him, and what he decided not to do, is a decision that historians are still arguing about today. That video drops in 2 days.